At my daughter's $200,000 wedding, they made me work as a waiter because I was too embarrassing for their elite guests. When the Nobel Prize documentary came on TV mid-reception, suddenly I wasn't embarrassing anymore. This is the story of how one evening revealed the true nature of respect, dignity, and the invisible prejudices that shape our world. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you're listening from in the comments. The borrowed bow tie felt like a noose around my neck as I stood in the service corridor of Boston's most exclusive wedding venue. The Harbor Club's marble floors gleamed under crystal chandeliers that cost more than most people's annual salaries, while through the frosted glass doors, I could hear champagne glasses clinking at my own daughter's reception, where I would serve drinks instead of celebrating as the father of the bride. An MY reflection in the service corridor's mirror showed a man transformed. Gone was the distinguished professor who had lectured to packed auditoriums at MIT, replaced by someone invisible, forgettable, designed to blend into the background while more important people conducted their important business. That MY name is Dr. William Hayes. At 72 years old, I never imagined I'd be telling you about how my daughter's wedding day became both the most humbling and ultimately the most triumphant moment of my life. The irony wasn't lost on me that the same hands now adjusting a service worker's bow tie had once held the Nobel Prize in Physics in Stockholm, awarded just 4 years earlier for work that had taken me decades to complete. But that evening, standing in a uniform that smelled of industrial starch and other people's dreams, none of my achievements seemed to matter to the people who would decide whether I belonged in my own daughter's celebration. The transformation from respected scientist to invisible server hadn't happened overnight. It was the culmination of months of subtle humiliations, each one delivered with the practiced cruelty of people who measured human worth in dollar signs, stock portfolios, and social connections that opened doors to exclusive clubs where academic achievements were curiosities rather than accomplishments. To understand how I arrived at this moment, you need to know about Emma, the brilliant, beautiful daughter who had been the center of my universe since her mother died when she was just 8 years old. Margaret Hayes had been everything I wasn't: socially graceful, emotionally intuitive, capable of making strangers feel like old friends within minutes of meeting her. She was the one who hosted faculty dinner parties that turned colleagues into lifelong friends, who remembered everyone's birthdays and anniversaries, who could navigate complex social situations with an ease that still amazed me after 15 years of marriage. Our faculty house near MIT's campus had been alive with her presence. The sound of her piano drifting through rooms where she practiced Chopin nocturnes after dinner, the smell of fresh-baked cookies that appeared whenever neighborhood children looked hungry, the constant stream of graduate students and visiting professors who found in our home a warmth that their dormitories couldn't provide. The aneurysm took her on a Tuesday morning in March while she was tending to the garden she'd carefully planned to bloom in sequence from spring through fall. Emma had been at school, working on a third-grade project about the solar system, blissfully unaware that her world was about to collapse into a before and after that would define the rest of her childhood. That I can still remember the exact moment when Dr. Patricia Williams pulled me aside in that sterile hospital corridor, her face grave with the kind of news that shatters lives into fragments that never quite fit back together the same way. "I'm sorry, Dr. Hayes. We did everything we could." The aneurysm was massive and sudden. She didn't suffer, and there was nothing anyone could have done differently. Standing there under fluorescent lights that hummed with electrical indifference, I felt my world collapse into a single, devastating realization. I was now responsible for raising our 8-year-old daughter alone, with no roadmap for how to be both mother and father to a child who would wake up tomorrow asking where mommy had gone. That night remains burned into my memory with the clarity that trauma provides. Emma had crawled into my bed around midnight, her small body shaking with sobs she was too young to understand fully, but too intuitive to dismiss as temporary. "Daddy, is mommy really not coming home?" "Not ever." The question hung in the darkness, like a challenge to everything I thought I understood about explaining difficult concepts. I'd spent my career breaking down complex theoretical frameworks into comprehensible components, but nothing in quantum mechanics had prepared me for explaining death to an 8-year-old who still believed in the tooth fairy. "No, sweetheart," I'd whispered, holding her close while my own tears fell silently into her strawberry blonde hair that smelled of the children's shampoo Margaret had chosen because it didn't sting if it got in her eyes. But I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. We're going to take care of each other, okay? Promise. I promise. It was a promise that would shape every decision I made for the next 20 years. The years that followed Margaret's death were a masterclass in adaptation and sacrifice that no graduate program could have prepared me for. I turned down prestigious conferences that conflicted with school plays, declined research opportunities that would require extended travel, and restructured my entire professional life around the rhythms of elementary school schedules and summer vacations. Our house became quieter after Margaret's death, but it also became more intentionally focused on the small rituals that would give Emma stability in a world that had proven itself capable of devastating change without warning. Dinner conversations revolved around her school day rather than my research. Saturday mornings meant pancakes shaped like dinosaurs and cartoon marathons instead of career-advancing networking events. "Daddy, why do you study space stuff when I'm right here on Earth?" 10-year-old Emma had asked one evening as I helped her with math homework at our kitchen table, her gap-toothed smile making my heart ache with a love so fierce it sometimes took my breath away. "Because understanding how the universe works helps me understand how incredibly lucky I am to have you in it," I'd replied, watching her face light up with the kind of joy that made every professional sacrifice seem not just worthwhile, but insignificant compared to this moment of connection. "Can we build a rocket ship out of cardboard boxes to visit the stars together?" "Absolutely. We'll start this weekend." Those were the golden years, when Emma believed her father could solve any problem with the right equation and enough patient explanation. When she'd sit on my lap in my home office while I graded papers, her small fingers tracing mathematical symbols she couldn't read but somehow understood were important to me. Therefore important to her. Doctor Sarah Chun from the chemistry department became particularly helpful during those early years, offering practical advice about everything from French braiding hair to navigating the social complexities of middle school friendships. Her own daughter Lisa was 2 years older than Emma, which made her insights invaluable for a man trying to anticipate challenges he'd never faced. "William," she'd said one afternoon as we watched our daughters play in her backyard, "you're doing an incredible job. Emma is thriving. And that's entirely because of your dedication to putting her needs first. Some days I feel like I'm failing her in 100 small ways," I'd admitted, watching Emma laugh at something Lisa had said. "Margaret would have known instinctively how to handle so many situations that leave me completely lost." "Margaret would be proud of both of you," Sarah had replied with gentle firmness. "You've created something beautiful together, a relationship built on love and respect and genuine communication." Middle school brought new challenges that tested my ability to be everything Emma needed. The transition from childhood to adolescence revealed gaps in my parenting that Margaret's absence made more pronounced. Emma began asking questions about makeup and boys and social hierarchies that operated according to rules I'd never learned. I remember the morning she got her first period. She was 13, and I was grading quantum mechanics exams in my office when I heard her crying in the bathroom. When I knocked on the door, she'd whispered through her tears that she needed Mom's stuff and didn't know what to do. The drive to 3 different pharmacies, standing bewildered in feminine hygiene aisles while trying to decipher the differences between products with names like Ultra Thin with Wings and Overnight Protection, remains one of my most humbling experiences as a parent. When I'd returned home with bags full of every possible option, I'd found Emma sitting on her bed, still crying. "I miss Mom," she'd said simply, and those 3 words contained all the grief and longing I'd been trying to shield her from for 5 years. "I miss her too," I'd admitted, sitting beside her on the bed we'd picked out together when she'd outgrown her princess face. "But she would be so proud of the young woman you're becoming." "How do you know?" "Because I'm proud of you every single day, and I learned everything I know about love from her." We'd cried together that afternoon, mourning the mother and wife who should have been there for moments like these. But we'd also grown closer, bound by the shared understanding that we were each other's anchor in a world that sometimes felt too big and complicated for a father and daughter navigating it alone. High school brought different complexities. Emma excelled academically, particularly in mathematics and science, showing an intuitive grasp of complex concepts that made my colleagues suggest she follow in my footsteps. But she also developed interests I couldn't share: fashion, social media, pop culture that felt alien to a man who'd spent his adult life buried in academic journals. "Dad, you need to understand TikTok," she'd insisted during her junior year, trying to show me videos on her phone that moved too fast for my aging eyes to follow. "This is how people communicate now. You can't just ignore entire cultural shifts because they seem frivolous." "I understand quantum mechanics," I'd replied with mock seriousness. "I think social media might be beyond my comprehension." "You're not that old," she'd laughed, and for a moment she'd looked exactly like her mother. All bright eyes and infectious humor that could make the most mundane conversations feel like celebrations. "Dad, I want to be a teacher," she'd announced during her senior year, her voice carrying the confident certainty of someone who'd found her calling. "Elementary education. I want to help kids discover that learning can be joyful instead of scary." The pride I'd felt in that moment was overwhelming. Here was my daughter, choosing a path that valued human development over financial gain, selecting a profession that would never make her wealthy, but might make countless children feel valued and capable. "That's wonderful, sweetheart," I'd said, meaning every word. The world needs teachers who understand that every child deserves to feel smart and capable. "You're not disappointed that I'm not going into physics. I'm proud that you're following your own path instead of mine. That takes more courage than continuing a family tradition." Emma chose education over physics, becoming an elementary school teacher who believed in nurturing young minds through encouragement rather than intimidation. Her salary was modest, barely $45,000 a year in one of the country's most expensive cities, but her impact was immeasurable. She taught third grade at the John F. Kennedy Elementary School in Cambridge, where her classroom walls were covered with student artwork and handwritten thank you notes from parents whose children had flourished under her patient care. "Mrs. Hayes makes math fun," one 8-year-old had written in crayon. "She doesn't make us feel stupid when we don't understand." That note had brought tears to my eyes when Emma showed it to me, because it captured everything beautiful about my daughter's character: her patience, her empathy, her ability to meet people where they were rather than where she thought they should be. When the Nobel Committee called at 4:47 a.m. on that October morning in 2018, Emma had been in her first year of teaching third grade. The recognition felt surreal, decades of theoretical work suddenly validated by the highest honor in scientific achievement. "Dad, that's incredible," she'd said when I'd finally reached her that afternoon, her voice bright with excitement and pride that made my heart swell. "I'm so proud of you. Richard, did you hear? Dad won the Nobel Prize." I'd heard Richard's voice in the background, muffled but audible. "Tell him congratulations. That's quite an honor for his field." For his field. The phrase had struck me as oddly dismissive, as if theoretical physics was some narrow specialty, rather than the foundation upon which all modern technology rested. But I dismissed the comment as simple ignorance, assuming that once Richard got to know me better, he'd understand the significance of the work that had earned international recognition. That I couldn't have been more wrong. Richard Sterling was everything I wasn't. Young at 32, aggressively ambitious, entrepreneurial in ways that had built Sterling Dynamics from a two-person startup into a multi-million-dollar quantum computing company in just 6 years. He possessed the kind of sharp business instincts that could identify market opportunities and exploit them with ruthless efficiency, though his understanding of the underlying physics that made his technology possible was superficial at best. I'd first noticed him at the charity fundraiser for science education, where I'd been the keynote speaker, an event that brought together academics, tech entrepreneurs, and philanthropists who shared an interest in improving STEM education for underserved communities. Richard had been standing near the bar with a group of well-dressed professionals who laughed too loudly at his jokes and hung on his every word with the calculated attention that successful people pay to other successful people. Emma had been volunteering at the event, helping coordinate silent auction items donated by local businesses and making sure the more demanding donors felt appropriately valued and heard. I'd watched her interact with everyone throughout the evening, her natural grace and genuine enthusiasm making even the most entitled supporters feel like their contributions mattered. "Dad, there's someone I'd like you to meet," she'd said during A quiet moment between auction announcements, her cheeks flushed with excitement and her eyes holding a brightness I hadn't seen since her mother died. Richard had approached with the confident stride of someone accustomed to commanding attention wherever he went. Dr. Hayes, I've heard so much about your work. Emma tells me you're doing fascinating research in theoretical physics. Actually, I'm semi-retired now. I'd replied immediately, sensing something calculated in his enthusiasm that felt more like networking than genuine intellectual curiosity. But yes, I spent most of my career working on quantum field theory. Quantum field theory, he'd repeated with the tone of someone filing away information for future use rather than exploring ideas for their own sake. That's the foundation for quantum computing, isn't it? Among other things, yes. My company, Sterling Dynamics, is working on practical quantum computing applications. Maybe we should talk sometime about potential collaboration opportunities. I'd nodded politely, but something about his approach felt transactional rather than intellectual. He wasn't interested in the elegance of the underlying mathematics or the philosophical implications of quantum mechanics. He was interested in what my knowledge could do for his business. Still, I tried to be supportive when Emma first brought him home for dinner 3 weeks later. She'd been nervous, clearly hoping we'd connect over our shared interest in physics, not realizing how different our approaches to the subject really were. Richard's company is developing quantum processors that could revolutionize everything, she'd said as we prepared dinner together in my small kitchen, her voice carrying the excited enthusiasm of someone who believed she was facilitating a perfect match between two people she cared about. Richard had arrived 30 minutes late, apologizing with practiced charm about a crucial investor call that had run long. He'd driven up in an $80,000 Tesla Model S, emerging from the vehicle like a magazine advertisement for success and modern sophistication. Dr. Hayes, he'd said, offering a handshake that was firm but brief, clearly calibrated to convey confidence without seeming aggressive. Thank you for having me. Emma's told me so much about you. All good things, I hope. I'd replied with the kind of dad joke that made Emma roll her eyes affectionately. Absolutely. She's incredibly proud of your academic achievements. The word academic had carried a subtle undertone that I'd noticed but initially dismissed. To Richard, academic seemed to mean theoretical rather than practical, respectable, but not particularly relevant to real-world concerns where money changed hands and markets moved based on quarterly results. Dinner had proceeded smoothly enough, with Richard asking polite questions about my research and sharing enthusiastic descriptions of his company's work. But as the evening progressed, I'd begun to notice troubling patterns in his responses that revealed fundamental gaps between our worldviews. When I'd asked about the specific quantum algorithms his team was developing, he deflected with vague references to proprietary methodologies and competitive advantages, language that suggested he was more comfortable discussing intellectual property strategy than intellectual content itself. Most troublingly, he'd seemed to view Emma as an acquisition rather than a partner, praising her in terms that sounded more like performance reviews than expressions of love and appreciation. Emma has such natural grace, he'd said while she was clearing dessert plates, his tone carrying the satisfied assessment of someone evaluating a valuable asset. She'll be perfect for entertaining clients and investors. Not everyone understands how to navigate those social dynamics successfully. The comment had made me deeply uncomfortable, though I'd struggled to articulate exactly why. There was something in his tone that reduced my daughter to a valuable resource rather than recognizing her as a person with her own thoughts, dreams, and aspirations. After he'd left that evening, Emma had lingered in the kitchen, clearly hoping for my approval and blessing for this relationship that obviously meant so much to her. "What do you think?" she'd asked, her voice carrying the same hopeful uncertainty. I remembered from her teenage years when she'd brought home report cards or art projects for my review. "He seems very successful," I'd said carefully, choosing my words to avoid dampening her obvious happiness while expressing my honest assessment. "But do you like him? Do you think he's good for me?" "I like that he makes you happy," I'd replied, which was completely true even as it avoided the deeper concerns I was beginning to develop. "That's what matters most to me." She'd hugged me, then, satisfied with an answer that said everything and nothing. But as I'd watched her drive away that night, following Richard's expensive car toward a life I couldn't quite envision, I'd felt the first stirrings of unease about where their relationship was heading. Their relationship progressed with the swift efficiency Richard applied to all his business ventures. Within 6 months of meeting at that charity fundraiser, Emma had moved into his Beacon Hill penthouse, a stunning 3,000-square-foot space overlooking Boston Harbor that looked more like a magazine spread than a home where people actually lived. The penthouse itself was a monument to Richard's success and his understanding of how success should be displayed. Everything was chosen for its investment potential rather than comfort or personal meaning. Italian leather furniture that looked beautiful but felt cold to the touch. Abstract paintings that Richard assured everyone were appreciating assets rather than expressions of artistic vision. "It's so different from our house," Emma had said during my first visit, her voice carrying mixed emotions I couldn't quite decipher. "Everything is so perfect. Perfect can be beautiful," I'd replied diplomatically, though I'd noticed she'd said "our house" when referring to the faculty home where she'd grown up, and his penthouse when describing the place where she now lived. The proposal had happened during a weekend trip to Napa Valley, orchestrated with the same attention to detail Richard applied to business presentations. He'd chosen a restaurant where dinner for two cost more than most people's monthly rent, secured a private table with views of vineyard-covered hills, and timed the proposal to coincide with sunset for optimal photographic documentation. Emma had called me from their hotel afterward, breathless with excitement and champagne and the overwhelming emotions that come with major life transitions. "Dad, he asked me to marry me. Can you believe it? The ring is absolutely beautiful. I've never seen anything like it. Congratulations, sweetheart," I'd said, genuinely happy for her joy even as something in my chest had tightened with apprehension about what this engagement might mean for our relationship and her future happiness. "We're thinking about having the wedding next fall at the Harbor Club. Dad, it's going to be so beautiful. Richard has such incredible taste, and he wants everything to be absolutely perfect." Perfect. Richard's favorite word, usually applied to things and people that met his exact specifications while somehow disappointing him in ways he couldn't articulate. 18 months after their first date, they were planning a wedding that would cost more than most people's houses. A $200,000 celebration that would serve as much as a networking opportunity for Richard's business associates as a declaration of love between two people who'd found their way to each other. The guest list revealed the extent to which their wedding had become a business event. Richard's side included tech industry leaders, venture capitalists, political figures, and major investors whose names appeared regularly in business journals and whose opinions influenced markets. Emma's side included elementary school teachers, a few college friends, and academic colleagues whose greatest achievements were measured in lives changed rather than dollars earned. The first major warning sign had come 6 months before the wedding, during what was supposed to be a family planning meeting at Richard's office downtown. Sterling Dynamics occupied 3 floors of a gleaming tower overlooking Boston Harbor, all glass and steel and expensive furniture designed to intimidate visitors and impress potential investors. The conference room where we met could have held 40 people, with leather chairs that probably cost more than most people's cars arranged around a mahogany table that gleamed under track lighting designed to eliminate shadows and create an atmosphere of clarity and decisive action. "William, we need to discuss the wedding arrangements," Richard had begun, his tone carrying the authority he probably used with junior employees who needed difficult feedback delivered with corporate efficiency. "Specifically, your role in the ceremony and reception." "My role?" I'd asked, confused by the formal tone he was taking with his future father-in-law. "I assumed I'd walk him down the aisle and enjoy celebrating with your families and friends." "Of course you'll walk her down the aisle," Richard had said quickly, though something in his tone suggested even that tradition was negotiable if circumstances required it. "That's expected. But I'm talking about the reception, the social aspects of the evening." Emma had shifted uncomfortably in her chair, clearly aware of what was coming but powerless to stop a conversation she'd probably already had with Richard. In private, her hands twisted in her lap, and she wouldn't meet my eyes. Telltale signs of the anxiety that had plagued her since childhood whenever she was caught between competing loyalties. "My guests are very prominent people," Richard had continued, his voice gaining the confident rhythm of a presentation he'd clearly rehearsed multiple times. Tech industry leaders, venture capitalists, political figures, major investors. This isn't just a wedding. It's a networking opportunity that could shape our future in ways that extend far beyond a single evening. I understand, I'd said, though I hadn't understood at all where this was leading or why my presence at my own daughter's wedding required special management. The thing is, William, your background doesn't really align with the conversations these people will be having. Stock options, market analysis, policy development, international trade agreements. You know, high-level business strategy that affects global markets and shapes entire industries. The words had hit like a series of physical blows, each one more devastating than the last. My daughter's fiancé was telling me that 45 years of academic achievement, decades of research that had advanced human knowledge and enabled the technology revolution he profited from, wasn't sophisticated enough for his wedding guests. Dad's incredibly intelligent, Emma had protested weakly, her voice carrying the desperate tone of someone trying to stop a car accident they could see coming but couldn't prevent. He just works in a different field than your friends. I'm not questioning his intelligence, Richard had replied smoothly, his tone suggesting that intelligence came in different categories, with academic intelligence ranking well below business acumen in terms of practical value. But let's be realistic here. What would he discuss with a venture capitalist who's evaluating billion-dollar market opportunities? How would he contribute to a conversation about emerging markets or startup valuations? Maybe it would be better, Richard had continued, warming to his theme as he outlined his vision for managing my problematic presence. If you kept a lower profile during the reception, you know, mingled quietly, avoided drawing attention to the differences in our backgrounds and social circles. I'm trying to protect everyone here, he'd insisted, his tone suggesting that his cruelty was actually kindness disguised as practical wisdom. Your father included. It would be incredibly awkward for him to feel out of place among my colleagues. And their families. These are people who summer in the Hamptons and winter in Aspen, who discuss art acquisitions and private jet schedules over dinner. The meeting had ended with vague agreements and uncomfortable silence that stretched like a chasm between us. As we'd walked to the parking garage afterward, Emma had taken my arm with desperate affection, her grip tight enough to leave bruises that would remind me for days of her anguish. Dad, he doesn't mean to sound condescending, she'd said though. Her voice suggested she knew exactly how condescending he'd sounded and was struggling to reconcile the man she loved with the words he'd just spoken. He's just nervous about the wedding going perfectly. There's so much pressure with all these important people coming. You'll still come, right? You'll still walk me down the aisle and celebrate with us. Nothing could keep me away from your wedding day. I'd promised, and I'd meant it with every fiber of my being, though I'd had no idea how I would fulfill that promise while maintaining any shred of dignity. But as I'd driven home through Cambridge streets lined with the familiar brick buildings where I'd spent most of my adult life, I'd felt smaller than I had in decades. The weight of Richard's dismissal had settled into my bones like winter cold. The solution came to me 2 weeks later, while reading a magazine article about the invisible workforce that keeps luxury events running smoothly, service workers who moved through wealthy social circles without being seen or acknowledged, essential to the experience but unnoticed by the guests they served. If Richard wanted me to be invisible, I'd give him exactly what he'd asked for, but on my terms, in a way that would let me witness every moment of my daughter's celebration, without causing the social disruption he feared. The plan was simple, elegant, and completely unanticipated by anyone who thought they knew Dr. William Hayes that I called Elegant Events, the catering company handling the wedding reception. This is Dr. William Hayes, I'd said to the manager, choosing my words carefully to avoid raising suspicions. I believe you're handling the Sterling Hayes wedding next Saturday at the Harbor Club. Yes, sir. How can I help you? I'd like to work the event as service staff. I have experience in hospitality from my college years, and I understand you sometimes need additional help for large functions. The manager had been confused but accommodating. Extra help was always welcome for events with over 200 guests, especially when those guests had reputations for demanding perfection. We typically require a uniform, she'd explained. Black pants, white shirt, bow tie, black vest. Standard formal service attire. Can you provide your own, or do you need us to arrange something? I can provide everything. I'd said, already planning a trip to the formal wear rental shop. I'll be there an hour before the reception begins for briefing and setup. Excellent. We appreciate the extra help, Dr. Hayes. The Sterling family has very high standards, and we want everything to be perfect. Perfect. Richard's favorite word that I hadn't told Emma about my plan. Let her believe I'd simply decided to attend as a guest and keep the low profile Richard had suggested. The surprise would come later. Saturday morning arrived with the crisp clarity of early autumn in Massachusetts, the kind of perfect New England day that made postcards and wedding photographers weep with joy. I dressed carefully in my rented service uniform, the bow tie feeling strange after decades of academic conferences where casual jackets were considered formal. Where did I in the mirror? I looked exactly like what Richard expected me to be. Invisible help. Someone whose presence wouldn't register with important guests who had more significant things to occupy their attention. The irony wasn't lost on me that the same hands now adjusting as service workers' bow tie had shaken hands with kings and presidents at the Nobel ceremony, had signed books for aspiring scientists, had been photographed holding one of the world's most prestigious awards. But as I looked at my reflection, I felt a strange sense of peace. Tonight, I would serve my daughters. Happiness rather than my own ego. The wedding ceremony itself was beautiful, held at Trinity Church where Emma had been baptized as a baby 28 years earlier. I sat in the back row, having arrived early to avoid the reception line. Emma glowed in her designer gown as her college roommate walked her down the aisle, a last-minute change that Richard had suggested. We want all the focus on Emma, he'd explained. Having her father walk her down might create distractions we'd rather avoid. So I watched from the back as my daughter married a man who'd convinced her that her father's presence was a distraction, rather than an essential part of her happiness. After the ceremony, I slipped away to prepare for my real role. The transformation from wedding guest to service worker felt symbolic. The Harbor Club staff in trance led through service corridors that smelled of cleaning supplies and nervous energy. I changed uniforms alongside young servers who treated this professionally but without my emotional investment. First time working this venue? Asked Maria, a college student. Yes, but I have experience with formal events. I replied truthfully. The pre-service briefing covered everything from wine selection to emergency protocols. The Harbor Club's standards were exacting. Every glass had to sparkle, every interaction had to reflect seamless professionalism. Remember, the catering manager emphasized, our job is to anticipate needs before they're expressed and to remain invisible while ensuring everything runs perfectly. As guests arrived for cocktails, I stationed myself near the bar, offering champagne and canapes. Richard's guests were exactly as promised. Successful, articulate people discussing market trends with insider knowledge that I served Patricia Worthington, a biotech entrepreneur fresh from a 9-figure sale. I offered canapes to David Chun, whose venture firm had funded 3 unicorn companies. I refilled glasses for Councilwoman Sarah Rodriguez, a potential gubernatorial candidate. They were impressive people, but they spoke about service workers with casual dismissiveness, viewing our jobs as inherently less valuable, performed by people whose opinions didn't matter. Excellent service tonight, one guest commented while I refreshed drinks. These people know how to stay invisible. You barely notice them, which is exactly right. Emma moved through the crowd radiant, accepting congratulations. When she passed my station, she smiled with automatic politeness, not recognizing her father. Behind the uniform, Dad looks handsome tonight. I heard her tell a bridesmaid, glancing toward Professor Mitchell from chemistry, the token academic Richard had invited as my replacement. The deception was perfect. During dinner service, I was assigned to the head table, steps from Emma, invisible but present. The conversations revealed Richard's family's assumptions about academics. Such a shame Emma's father couldn't be more involved, Victoria Sterling said as I served appetizers. These academic types are so awkward in real social situations. They don't understand how to conduct themselves among successful people. They live in such insular worlds, replied another guest, discussing theoretical concepts with no practical application. Thank goodness Richard can expose Emma to people who understand how the world really works. At a nearby table, a young tech entrepreneur explained his quantum computing work to investors. His description was enthusiastic but fundamentally flawed, misunderstanding principles I'd helped establish decades earlier. The breakthrough we've achieved is maintaining quantum coherence at room temperature, something no one thought possible until we developed our proprietary algorithms. I wanted to correct his errors, offer insights that could save his company millions. But my uniform rendered my expertise invisible. Then everything changed. The screens, meant for wedding photos, malfunctioned, continuing to show a PBS documentary about recent Nobel Prize ceremonies. Suddenly, my face filled multiple screens as the narrator described my research contributions. Dr. William Hayes of MIT revolutionized our understanding of quantum field interactions, enabling breakthrough developments that continue shaping our technological landscape. Complete silence fell over the reception. Dr. Elizabeth Chin stood up with academic excitement. That's him. That's our server. He's Dr. William Hayes. The revelation spread like electricity. Guests stared between the screens and my position by the bar, faces showing confusion, recognition, and growing amazement. Richard's champagne glass slipped, shattering against his plate. Emma rose from her chair, moving toward me with dawning horror. Dad, what are you doing? Why are you dressed like that? I slowly removed my bow tie, stepping out of invisibility by choice. Hello, sweetheart. Congratulations on your beautiful wedding. The room erupted. The invisible help had been the most accomplished person there all along. Dr. Chen approached with professional admiration. I've cited your work dozens of times. Your quantum field research opened entirely new avenues. For my lab, other guests converged, attitudes completely transformed. The Nobel laureates serving their champagne became the center of attention. Asterisk, why didn't you tell us? Someone asked. Because tonight isn't about me, I replied with quiet dignity. It's about Emma and Richard's celebration. Victoria Sterling stood. Slowly, her social facade cracking. Dr. Hayes, I had no idea. If we'd known, you'd have treated me differently? I asked gently. Why should my work change how you see my character? The question challenged everything about assumptions and respect. Richard approached, uncertain and apologetic. William, I'm so sorry for how I treated you. Would it have mattered if you'd known? I asked. Should respect depend on achievements? Or should it be something we offer simply because we're human? It should have mattered that you're Emma's father, he replied after a pause. That should have been enough. Emma reached me, tears gathering. Dad, I'm so sorry. I should have stood up for you. You don't need to apologize, sweetheart. I chose to work tonight because I wanted to be here for your celebration, regardless of how anyone saw me. But you're a Nobel Prize winner. Awards don't define worth any more than job titles do. I'm proud of my research, but prouder of raising a daughter who teaches children because she believes education matters more than profit. The evening transformed into an academic symposium. The same people who'd ignored me competed for my attention, their enthusiasm genuine but tinged with embarrassment. The young entrepreneur eagerly asked about quantum computing solutions. Patricia Worthington invited consulting discussions. The venture capitalist requested speaking engagements. The man Richard had considered irrelevant to business was being courted by investors who suddenly recognized expertise they'd dismissed hours earlier based on superficial assumptions about academic achievement and practical value. As the evening wound down and guests gradually began to depart, many stopped to thank me for what they described as an unexpectedly educational and inspiring experience. The conversations that followed revealed how the night's events had challenged their assumptions about respect, achievement, and the invisible prejudices that shaped their interactions with people from different backgrounds. Dr. Chen left her business card with requests for future collaboration on research projects that could benefit from my theoretical insights. Several tech entrepreneurs asked about consulting opportunities that could help their companies avoid the kind of fundamental errors I'd witnessed earlier in their quantum computing discussions. But the most meaningful conversations weren't about professional opportunities or business collaborations. They were with service workers who'd witnessed the evening's transformation and understood its deeper implications about dignity, respect, and the arbitrary nature of social hierarchies. Maria, the college student who'd worked alongside me throughout the evening, approached as I prepared to change back into my street clothes. Dr. Hayes, she said shyly, her voice carrying admiration mixed with something deeper, I just wanted to thank you for how you treated me tonight. I had no idea who you were, but you showed me such kindness and respect throughout the evening. That meant more than you know. We're all just people doing our jobs, I replied, thinking about the evening's lessons and revelations. Treating each other with respect shouldn't depend on knowing each other's credentials or achievements. The comment seemed to resonate with other service workers who'd overheard our conversation. Several approached to share their own experiences of being treated as invisible by wealthy clients who saw them as extensions of the furniture rather than human beings deserving of basic courtesy and recognition. Tonight was different, one server said thoughtfully. Watching how those guests' attitudes changed when they learned who you were. It made me think about how arbitrary these social distinctions really are. As Emma and Richard prepared to leave for their honeymoon in Japan, the evening's revelations had transformed what should have been a simple farewell into something much more significant and emotionally complex. "Dad," Emma said, taking my hands as we stood in the Harbor Club's elegant lobby where we'd said goodbye after countless other family events over the years. "When we get back from Japan, I want you to tell me everything about your research. I want to understand what you've accomplished, what it means for the world, how it connects to the things Richard's company is trying to build." "I'd love that," I replied, meaning every word while recognizing that her request represented a fundamental shift in how she saw both her father and her husband's work. "But remember, the work is just work. You're my greatest accomplishment, and that will always be true regardless of any awards or recognition." "I know," she said, embracing me with fierce affection that felt like a promise of renewed closeness. "And everyone else knows it too now." Richard stood beside her, clearly struggling with emotions and realizations that would take time to fully process. The evening had challenged everything he thought he understood about value, achievement, and the relationship between academic work and practical success. "William," he said as their car arrived, "I hope you'll give me a chance to make up for tonight, for how I treated you, how I misunderstood what you've contributed to the world. I'd like to learn more about your work, about how it relates to what we're doing at Sterling Dynamics." "I'd be happy to discuss that," I replied, recognizing the sincerity in his voice even as I wondered whether this transformation would prove lasting or temporary. "But more importantly, I hope you'll remember that Emma's worth isn't determined by her ability to enhance your business relationships. She's remarkable because of who she is, not because of what she can do for your career." The observation seemed to strike home, and Richard nodded with the kind of understanding that comes from genuine reflection rather than social obligation. As their car pulled away from the Harbor Club, I stood in the valet area still wearing my service uniform, processing an evening that had challenged every assumption about visibility, respect, and the arbitrary nature of social hierarchies that determined whose contributions mattered and whose could be safely ignored. 3 months later, I received an invitation to speak at Richard's company's quarterly meeting about the intersection of theoretical physics and practical technology development. The audience included many of the same people who'd attended the wedding, but this time they listened with the attention and respect that my earlier invisibility had prevented. The presentation went well, covering fundamental principles that might seem abstract but had practical applications throughout the technology industry. I explained how quantum field theory provided the mathematical framework for understanding semiconductor behavior, how statistical mechanics governed thermal management in computer processors, and how information theory connected abstract mathematical concepts to real-world data storage and transmission systems. Emma sat in the front row, beaming with pride as I explained concepts that finally helped her understand why her father's work mattered so much beyond academic circles, how it connected to everything these companies were trying to build and the technological infrastructure that shaped modern life. "Dad, that was incredible," she said after the presentation, her face glowing with newfound understanding and appreciation. "I finally understand why your research is so important, how it forms the foundation for all these practical applications I see every day. It matters because it helps people create things that improve lives," I replied, thinking about the evening's discussions and the genuine curiosity I'd seen in audience questions. "Just like your teaching matters because you help children discover their potential and believe in their own worth." The consulting opportunities that followed were numerous and intellectually stimulating. Companies across multiple industries wanted insights about fundamental scientific principles that could inform their research and development strategies, help them avoid costly mistakes, and identify promising directions for future innovation. But more importantly, the relationships that developed were built on mutual respect rather than the transactional networking that had characterized my earlier interactions with Richard's business associates. 6 months after the wedding, Richard and Emma hosted a small dinner party at their home. The guest list included Dr. Chun and several other scientists, along with a few of Richard's business colleagues who'd been at the wedding and wanted to continue conversations that had begun. That evening, the atmosphere was completely different from our earlier interactions. Conversations flowed naturally between theoretical concepts and practical applications, between academic insights and entrepreneurial vision, creating the kind of interdisciplinary dialogue that produces genuine innovation rather than superficial. Networking.as I watched my daughter laugh at something Richard had said. I realized that the evening of invisibility had taught all of us valuable lessons about recognition, respect, and the importance of seeing people clearly rather than through the filters of assumption and prejudice. "You know, William," Richard said as we stood on his balcony after dinner, looking out over Boston Harbor where lights reflected like scattered stars on the water's surface. "I've been thinking a lot about that night. About what I learned, about what I almost threw away because of my own arrogance and misplaced priorities." "What did you learn?" I asked, genuinely curious about his perspective on events that had changed all of us in fundamental ways. "That the most important things can't be measured in dollars or status symbols," he replied with the kind of humility that only comes from genuine transformation rather than social obligation. "That respect and love are earned through character, not achievements. That I was incredibly lucky Emma chose to love me despite my failures to see what really mattered. She chose to love you because she saw potential for growth," I said, thinking about my own marriage and the grace Margaret had shown in loving an absent-minded professor who sometimes struggled with social situations. Just like her mother chose to love me despite my own imperfections and social awkwardness. We stood in comfortable silence, two men who'd found understanding through shared mistakes and the grace of a woman who believed in second chances and the possibility of genuine change. 2 years later, when Emma and Richard's son was born, William Richard Sterling, named after both his grandfathers, I held him with hands that had served champagne to people who dismissed my life's work, had accepted Nobel Prizes from kings and presidents, and had spent decades solving mathematical equations that unlocked secrets of the universe. But in that moment, holding my grandson, none of those achievements mattered as much as the simple privilege of being present for another beginning, another opportunity to demonstrate that love could overcome pride and wisdom could emerge from the most unexpected circumstances. "He's beautiful," I whispered to Emma as she recovered from delivery, exhausted but glowing with the fierce joy that comes with new motherhood. "He's going to grow up knowing his grandfather is brilliant," she replied. "But more importantly, he's going to learn that brilliance means nothing without kindness." Richard stood beside us, transformed from the arrogant young entrepreneur who'd once tried to hide his future father-in-law into someone capable of genuine humility and authentic relationship. The change wasn't complete, personal growth never is, but it was real and ongoing. Sometimes the most important moments come when we're forced to examine our own biases, when we discover that worth and wisdom can appear in unexpected forms, and when we learn that true success is measured not in awards or achievements, but in the love we show and receive from the people who matter most. The evening had taught me that invisibility could be a choice rather than a judgment, that dignity could be maintained regardless of how others chose to see you, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you could do was simply continue being who you were, regardless of whether anyone was paying attention. More importantly, it had shown Emma and Richard that respect shouldn't depend on knowing someone's credentials, that service work deserved the same courtesy as any other profession, and that the arbitrary hierarchies we create often blind us to the wisdom and worth of people we dismiss as unimportant. The Nobel Prize sits on my bookshelf now, next to photographs of Emma's wedding, pictures of my grandson's first steps, and thank you notes from students whose lives were touched by teachers who learned to see every child as capable of greatness. But the real prize, the one that matters most, is the knowledge that love can overcome pride, that dignity can survive dismissal, and that sometimes the most profound transformations happen when we choose to serve others rather than ourselves. The night I chose to be invisible so I could be present taught me that true visibility comes not from recognition or status, but from the courage to remain loving and dignified regardless of how others choose to see you. That's the legacy I want to leave. Not just scientific discoveries or academic achievements, but the understanding that every person we encounter is deserving of respect. Every job that serves others has value, and every act of love, no matter how small or unnoticed, makes the world a little better for everyone who shares it. The evening that began with borrowed bow ties and serving trays had become a story about the invisible threads that connect us all. The recognition that we rise or fall together, that kindness is never wasted, and that sometimes the most important work we do is simply showing up with dignity and grace for the people we love. Regardless of whether anyone else notices or approves, that if you enjoyed this story, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever been underestimated because of assumptions people made about your background or occupation? How did you handle it? Share your experiences with our community. Listen to another story about overcoming prejudice and finding strength in unexpected places. Click on the video suggestion that appears on your screen. Thank you for listening, and remember, every person you meet deserves the respect you'd want to receive yourself.